Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and get started with this session. This is our last session for the day at the eLearning Rockstar stage. My name is Zach Batty. I'm with eLearning Brothers, and it is my privilege to introduce Bill Milstid to you all. Bill Milstid has built one of the coolest games I have ever seen in Storyilne. And I mean, there are Storyilne games, and then there are Storyilne games, and Bill Milstid has built the latter. What you should also know about Bill Milstid is he is the father of two children. One of them is a newborn, so he is the only person in the history of Las Vegas to come here to get a good night's rest. He also tells me that he is the reigning neighborhood nap champion. So I don't know how those two things work together, but please put your hands together for Bill Milstid.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Bill Milstid, and I built a game in Storyilne 3. But I built it using Storyilne 3's built-in functionality for everything. So no JavaScript, just variables and triggers. It's called Evelyn's Quest. It's available, obviously, for download on the eLearning Brothers library. And it looks like this. So this is some video of real gameplay from the Storyilne file that we have available for you guys. The basic premise of the game is this. Follows a girl named Evelyn. She's chosen for her purity of heart to find and defeat an evil darkness that's consuming her world. She encounters several characters along the way, and some of those provide assistance while others harm her. When she's harmed, Evelyn can visit a magical spring to refresh her health by answering challenge questions. At several additional points along the way, she has to solve puzzles to earn rewards necessary to defeat some bosses that she encounters. So real gameplay in Storyilne 3, a pretty sizable amount of which is editable by you guys, the users. And honestly, I actually think it might be kind of a proof of concept in a lot of ways for what we can do at eLearning Brothers, but we'll touch on that maybe a little bit as we go. All right. So before we get too far into it, I want to do just kind of a quick show of hands, maybe. How many of you guys, folks in this room, have experience building games, especially when it comes to like rapid development? Okay, a couple of you. So not many. That's probably a good thing in a lot of ways because we can touch on some stuff that folks maybe aren't familiar with. So what I do want to do is ask anybody then what you guys think the most critical experience or critical step rather of the game development process is. If I could maybe get a volunteer, right? What's that? Trigger. Okay, yeah, that's a pretty important thing. So I'm thinking more. What's that? There we go. That's what I was looking for. So planning, right? In my experience, just like the rest of every e-learning project, most critical step in the process is upfront content design and planning, which I'm sure the IDs in the crew would probably be loving that, but maybe not so much the devs, but it's true. This step is crucial to successful development down the line with a project as complicated as an e-learning game, but we often don't put a lot of time into it. So, with that being said, what I want to talk to you guys about today, a little bit up front, at least for the first half, is the basic process that I took to build this game, and then we'll peek kind of along the way at how the game evolved, maybe kind of talk about some lessons learned. And then after that, I want to look at some practical examples that you guys can use in your own development. Okay. So that being said, it's probably a good time to mention I uploaded some assets for you to access after you leave the presentation today. So check the link on screen there, take a picture, whatever you need. If you go there, you'll be able to find a few reference links to just some ideas that might be beneficial for you, as well as a simple Storyilne reference file that you can download and play with potentially for your own projects and repurpose, okay? I'm also really going to try to skim over the basic first part here about basic process, just to get to the tips and tricks portion and look a little bit under the hood of the game. If you need more detail on the process portion that we're going to talk about, feel free to check out the ELB blog. We actually have a link to an older webinar that can go over some of this stuff for you guys if you'd like. So, process. The way we'll be talking about process real quickly today is really most probably applicable to like a smaller development team, I think. Kind of a one-man shop, like fairly linear approach to development that doesn't really touch on a formal formal process or iterative reviews, things like that. It's real high level. So kind of points to keep in mind when you're building through your own process, whatever that happens to be, okay? And I hope that's valuable to you guys. I've experienced a lot of limitations on budget and time and things like that within the L&D space, so I'm hoping that approaching this in a kind of a simplified manner will be beneficial to some folks in the audience, right? So here we go. So the basic process that I used, again, really simplified, not fitting into a formal system here, is this. Brainstorm, story outline, visualization, pre-production, production. Woo, that went really quickly. Sorry about that, guys. Pre-production, production development, and then kind of a post-development review cycle or appropriate testing. Okay. So we hit it at the beginning of this, right? Planning is always the most critical piece of this kind of a thing. I spent an immense amount of time in the planning process, and I still missed a lot of points here. I ended up with a number of gaps that I could have caught along the way. And that's because planning really should cover a ton of ground when you're building an e-learning game, right? So brainstorming the idea, defining gaming elements, storyboarding, early UAT if you go that far. We could probably spend an entire talk just talking about planning for games, right? And if you're not familiar with kind of the background for games, there are plenty of sessions every year that talk about that, gaming elements, right? Rules, goals, meaning, risk, reward, how those impact games. We're not going to get into a ton of that stuff today. If you want to know a little bit more about it, I'm sure our friends over at the game agency could probably point you in a good direction there. They've got a ton of stuff that they do that certainly overlap what we're going to be talking about today. Similarly, on the link that I had mentioned before, there's this link, which don't worry about copying that down because it's super long. It's on that bit.ly link I gave you. This is just kind of a background piece of info that Allen Interactions has out there that gives you guys some additional resources, 40 gaming resources for you to review, background, and all the way through the process, okay? So, all right, so real planning here. First step in planning, always for me, is brainstorming, and for me, this is a pencil and paper process. I rough out ideas and bullet points, and then I turn those into a kind of a big doodly brain map of whatever the leading idea happens to be. In this case, right, one of the benefits of spending a lot of time in planning is that it helped me realize some pretty big limitations on the game and guided my design for the game. So our goal was to create a game pretty much entirely, as I stated at the top of this, using Storyline 3's built-in functionality, right? And it had to be editable by users of a whole bunch of different skill sets in different, industries with different content, repurposed to fit whatever you guys may need. So that obviously kind of limits some gameplay complexity, and in turn, that affects your story and your design. Kind of all of that piece together, what I do after I've kind of got everything, road mapped and roughed out, I just move it straight over to Word, and I begin mapping out an actual story. I use Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey as a basic guide when I'm doing this kind of thing because it's a nice support, right? If you're not familiar, check out Wikipedia. It's the easiest, quickest place to go, and it's got everything you need on there. It'll feel very familiar to you. This is the basic framework for pretty much all archetypal stories. If you're a Star Wars fan, for instance, this pretty much is the hero's journey. It leans very heavily there. Moving on from planning, right? So basically getting all of your big living Word document of all of your ideas laid out, set together, streamlined. I move into visualization. I'll translate those ideas that have gone from paper to Word into a flowchart, as visual as I can possibly make it, right? And there's a few reasons for this. One, it helps you visualize the flow of the game and look for gaps or misconnections, things like that in the story. That'll also help you identify potential pinch points or problem areas in the development, which will save time for downstream, right? Or save time downstream. So for instance, if you've got, like in this, it's hard to see on this visualization, but we've got a loop in the game where a user takes an action and they actually have to, come all the way back to the beginning of the game. Visualizing that, seeing how that actually affects the story in the game gave me a good idea of how to approach development once I actually got there. Another reason for visualizing these things is it helps provide a framework for discussions that you might have with a team. So you've got other stakeholders, you've got approvers you need to pass this through. Showing a big doodly brain map or a Word document filled with bullet points and notes off to the side may not always be the most beneficial or constructive thing to do. This kind of helps them put a picture on what it is that you're talking about, see how things flow from start to end point, and what all interrelates. All right, so flow established. What I do is I kind of move into what I call a proof of concept stage. This is where I basically go in and I sketch out the environment, a few characters to set tone. I'll begin a wireframe, and that's actually what's a video on the right-hand side here, just with rough elements to get a basic feel for gameplay elements, right? How things move, how things interact on screen, to again really get a proof of concept going and share with stakeholders. This is a pretty key step to get right because it sets up the backbone of gameplay. And again, misses here, just like at the earlier stages, can actually have a pretty profound impact down the line. So once you got your proof of concept done, we would obviously move into the development stage. I like to break my development up into kind of two pieces. I personally like to front load development. So I like to lay out scenes pretty cleanly in another tool like Photoshop or Illustrator if I'm building the assets, or obviously if I'm purchasing them or downloading them from a library. Go ahead and pull those out, set everything up the way that I need it, and get all of my media exported, ready to go before I ever touch real development, okay? And so this helps streamline the development process, right? Obviously, if you're working with a production department, that's going to look a lot different for you. But if you're doing it yourself, I would suggest front loading. Again, it just saves time. Make sure that you don't have any missed gaps, and when you're working by yourself on a one-man team, that's often pretty critical. Once all your media is ready, it's pretty simple, right? You move it into Storyline, you start assembling it. But that simple thing gets pretty complicated pretty quick, and we're actually, after this, going to take a look at that. After you work your magic, do whatever it is that you do, make it more or less complicated, move on to testing, finish out your process, whatever that looks like, right? That's the entirety of what I do to get to the end of the game that I'm going to show you guys in a second. You can fit that into Addy, you can fit that into Sam, you can fit that into Letter Salad, whatever it is that you use for your production process. Those kind of points are pretty critical to kind of keep along the way and make sure that you're touching on in your development piece. So that being said, now let's move to a practical look of how we did this. So how I did that thing. We're going to look under the hood. One of, if you remember back to the very first beginning video that I showed you guys, we have a character who she walks across the screen, okay? Most games, right? We've got a character who has to move across the screen. In Storyline, that's a bit of a challenge, right? You've got one set fixed size for your screen. So how do you move a character across that screen without it moving off the screen? Does anybody have any ideas for that? What's that? He got it. That's exactly right. So walking in Storyline is an illusion, right? You achieve the illusion of an object moving across the screen by moving the background instead. So if you can add a perspective change or animation to your character at the same time that that's going, it makes it a little more convincing. And if you can add like detailed animation, even the better. Now, if you layer objects in the background, and again, we'll look at some of this in just a second, you can apply different easing or animation timings to play with parallax and make things look even more realistic. Now, we're going to bounce to taking a look at this in Storyline right now. First, what I'm going to do, because this is going to look really complicated when I open it up, I want to look at a preview of kind of things walking and moving on screen in the actual game. And then I'm going to show you the stage itself, just so you can kind of get a feel for what it really looks like in the source file. And then we're going to move right away from the source file, and I'm going to show you the real simple sample that I put up for you to download. It's probably easier to talk through when we're talking about this stuff, okay? So let me move over and see if this is not... Yep, I apologize. We are... All right. Okay, here we are. All right, so if I click my navigation item on my project here, right? We've got our main character in the center of the screen. She changes state, she releases an animation, and our background moves as we click forward and back. Obviously, there's kind of an upper limit on that. As I move her over to this one object in the middle here, she kind of stops moving, and we limit gameplay motion. That, which looks somewhat complicated, is actually incredibly simple to do. So I'm going to try to pull up the sample here. Let's see if I can drag that over for you. And here's the simple sample of this file that I actually posted for you on eLearning Brothers. It shows you exactly how we're doing it. Now, so if you look on the triggers pane over here, you can see pretty much exactly what we've got. We've got a background object, right? One large shape on the back of the stage. We've got some navigational items, and then we've got this white square on the left. That's going to kind of serve as our, our character for now. Our background is obviously our background. Our arrows are obviously our navigational elements. When I click the right arrow, real simple triggers happen here. We move the rectangle, that background object, on BG slide left, which is clearly the motion path moving to the left whenever the object is clicked. So nice and simple. You'll notice there's a conditional on that. We'll touch on that in just a second. But it looks exactly the way that it did in our game, if I can see how to preview it. And I apologize again for all the technical difficulties here. All right. So moving back. So one obvious issue with setting up a game like this where you've got a scrolling background that moves left and right on the screen is the actual image sizes that we're required to use in Storyline, right? So an obvious implication here, is it set up? I can't, okay, cool. An obvious implication here of having a large background image like that is that we have to deal with Storyline's maximum sizes. Something to know is that it appears as though Storyline only accepts about a 2,000 pixel maximum image size, okay? And I apologize for all of the technical concerns here. Okay, so one of the biggest challenges with setting up a background that scrolls in Storyline is that there are limitations on the background image size that you can use. It appears as though the maximum size for Storyline appears to be, it's about 2,000 pixels, which obviously limits you. Some of the images that I used for the backgrounds of this game were actually upwards of like 10,000 pixels wide. Well, the reason for that obviously is we have a longer level. We have deeper gameplay. We have more complexity that we can add. So does anybody have any ideas of how you can get around, if you've got a 10,000 pixels, wide image, and you've got a limitation of only 2,000 pixels wide in Storyline. Anybody know how we might be able to fool Storyline into accepting larger images in the background? Yeah. What's that? So you're saying put them on additional layers. Does anybody else have any other ideas on that? That's a way to do it, certainly. Now, one challenge with that is as you move your navigation, you've got to control those layers, right? So what I do is actually I take a slightly simpler tack, and I just chop my big images up into much smaller images, and then I reassemble them in Storyline in the Edit States pane, right? So if we've got, a background image that needs to span 5-6 times the size of the Storyline will allow it, click on that, import your main, click on Edit States, go on in the background and drop more images in, align them, and now you have a pretty mega huge image that you can scroll at will. Yeah. Now again, I apologize, I'm going to skip trying to bounce back and forth and show you guys this in the Storyline piece, but what I've done is I've simplified that process as well, so you can kind of see how that works in that simple sample file that I've put up for you, okay? Now, one challenge that you will encounter if you're going to try to move backgrounds and things of that nature and create your own moving scene in Storyline is that you have to, at some point, limit motion, right? Either to set a start and end point for your levels, right? There's a point beyond which you cannot go back and a final point beyond which you cannot pass. So how do you set that up, right? Well, I do that with variables. And again, I try to keep this as simple as humanly possible. So I used a variable called xpos that starts at 0, and it works as a conditional that on all the triggers that move my background, that move my characters, change the state of my characters. That's it. As you hit the navigational button and your background moves, every time that background item finishes moving, it increments or decrements that xpos variable and serves as kind of a checker so that I know where my character is at all stages along the way, right? So if you've got a point where you need to stop the user from moving, to pick up an item, to force an interaction, to deal with a big bad, whatever you've got set up for that level, keeping a running tally of where your character is the way to do it. You can see on the side here the trigger panes that I've used for that, right? So change state of Evelyn to Evelyn forward, or from Evelyn forward to walk when the user clicks if X pause is less than thresh pause. Now, if you're setting this up, and in the simple sample that you'll see, I've given you pretty much the exact same actions to play with, only you won't see that thresh pause in there. You'll see like a number. What that is a global variable that belongs to this actual game that you can download. I was saying that at the top of this that a lot of the stuff is editable by you. This is an example of that. So, like if you downloaded Evelyn's Quest and you wanted to edit it to make it, we're only going to move the background twice. Well, you can do that. All you have to do is access the, global variables and change whatever that threshold pause is. You get to control it at will. And that's also quite easy to set up. So. All right, timers are your friend. That's the next thing I want to talk about here. So some of the more complicated actions in the game are actually accomplished with stacks of triggers based on timers that are placed on screen. So if you look over to the left-hand side of this storyline stage, obviously on screen you're going to see a ton of animation, motion paths, and then off stage you see a bunch of circles, and all those have motion paths. Those are timers. So basically, the way that I use those is, let's say I've got a situation like in this scene where I've got character 1, character 2, I've got to have character 2 attack character 1, and he's got to do it on a somewhat regular interval. Well, there are a few ways that you can accomplish something like that. You could actually take a layer approach, which would be a really good way to do something like that. So you could, as the character 1 interacts with character 2, we pop a layer. Something happens, and then we reset the layer every, say, 2 seconds, if you're going to have an attack timer for 2 seconds. Problem with that is that it's pretty one-dimensional. You can only control it in terms of a single unit of time. Using timers like this is actually kind of a lot more complicated, but a lot simpler and a lot easier to do in the same way. Basically, what I do is, for whatever action it is that I need to occur on screen, if I need it to occur at a regular or irregular interval, I'll set up an object off screen that has a motion path of its own, okay? So whenever I want to trigger that event, based on whatever my time is, I'll trigger an initial timer, okay? It'll run through, my event will take place, and then once that event takes place, it'll trigger that timer again. So in this case, to make that a little clearer, guy on the right, once we encounter him, he kind of shoots those black blobs out at Evelyn and attacks, right? That happens about every 4 seconds, and then every 3 seconds, and then it kind of varies a little bit. And the way that that's done is, once Evelyn over here hits the X position that brings her to this character, right? He appears, comes on stage. Once he's on stage, one of these attack timers starts to move. Once that attack timer moves, it releases one of those blobs to go attack our main character. And then that kind of repeats at a regular interval until we've either beaten that character or lost, right? Now, you can accomplish a whole lot of things by using that really simple process. One of them, actually, kind of putting all this stuff together, is that you can lock characters and anchor them to one another. This actually, I do wish I could show you this one, but I'll just have to act it out if you want. So one of the things that's going on in this exact same scene, as our character walks in, right, our big bad kind of pops up, starts shooting at her. Your first inclination is to try to move up or down to get away from our character, to get away from these, fireballs that he's shooting at the character, or at Evelyn here. Well, every time she does that, our big bad moves up to match wherever she is. If she's moved up, he moves up. If she moves down, he moves down, and continues to attack. If you'll notice, we've got 3 of the different attack objects, these little black fireball things going on. It's because each one of those are hidden, and based on where her position is on the screen, we check, a different one will release, a timer will go, and it will fly across the stage. So we have this really interesting effect of character moving up, slight lag, secondary character moving up to match whatever that first character's position is, up or down, and then releasing an attack. And the way that that's done is actually by putting together the things that we just talked about, right? So checking the actual position of an object or a character on the screen with a variable, and by incrementing or decrementing it after your background objects move, right? And then using timers to cause an action or to cause a response to something that the user has just done. All right. So, another thing that you guys might want to think about playing with when you're dealing with your games is add GIFs. At the top of this, when we saw our character moving across the screen, the way that that's done is just with it's an animated GIF. Animated GIFs can add a ton of depth to your presentation, to your project, but they have a few things to note. One, it seems like the storyline's limited to about a 10 frame per second rate. All right, so whatever it is that you're going to build in, if it's Photoshop, After Effects, whatever, target for that. If you don't, you're going to get some quality loss. You'll also see some frame loss, right? If you build something out at like 24 frames a second and then it pulls into storyline and drops 14 of those, you're going to get some real chunky movement. So I would really try to target the speed at which you build this thing out. Also, build them to size. One of the things Storyline doesn't seem to like is oversized animated GIFs. When you bring them down in size, it artifacts, you get a ton of pixelation, you start to see the dithering around the edges of it. So my suggestion there would be if you have a need for multiple sizes, build to multiple sizes. Build them to the exact size that you need them for. It's not always necessarily how we prefer to do things in another context with other graphic types, but in this case, it's the most friendly for your purposes. Kind of running through it here, let's just talk about this in terms of what I guess we put up in the library so that you guys can play with this kind of thing. We didn't get to go through a lot of the source file. I apologize for that. But I would assume from kind of what we've talked about, you guys can see how quickly complexity could add up in a game like this, right? And that is true. The source file for this is pretty complicated. But customization isn't an issue with this. What we've done is gone in and added a large number of variables that you can go in and control. So you can customize not only the content, obviously, in the game, and the questions that we use to quiz and test learners throughout the process, right? There are several pools you can add as you would, add a slide in the linear pools or add a question to the kind of a random pool that we have in there as you would any other course. Not only can you do that, but you can also, you can affect a lot of the other more nuanced elements in the game. So how long each level is, you can edit. When certain characters appear, or if they appear at all, you can edit those. If you have an issue where you can't run audio in your game, you can edit that without having to go on a slide-by-slide basis and pull that stuff out. We've set up core global variables that are in the triggers pane, or rather in the variables pane. You can go in, set your own values, tinker with that, and see how it affects the game overall. Kind of a good example of this is on every level, there's what I call a forced negative interaction, right? And basically, that is one point in the game where the user will get dinged no matter what they do. Right? They're walking across the stage, pine cone falls, hits them on the head, takes away some health, and then that requires them at some point to go back to that pool that we have of questions and regain health by answering challenges. You can turn that off if you don't have a need for that. If you want your user to be able to walk through scot-free, that's not a problem at all. And we've added documentation up on the library to kind of show you what can be edited, what it does, how it works, etc. So, that being said, there's a ton I would have liked to have shown you on this stuff today, but we were limited on time, so I didn't set it up. But I think in the future we may be setting up some additional webinars, blog posts, things of that nature, so maybe kind of keep an eye out on it. We've got some really cool things that this game does. We use object intersection, which is a new feature in Storyline a lot. Objects leaving and entering the slide, trigger events. We use state changes a number of places to trigger events. Those are kind of all cool things to just get in and tinker with and see how they work in a pretty complicated environment. Maybe we'll set up a blog post for that in the future. So one thing I did want to say, as we're going forward and developing these, is that we found a lot throughout the development of this. Found out that, for instance, Storyline 3 can handle vector graphics, which I did not know prior to. Implemented that towards the end of this, and really are starting to find that we can do some neat things with game development along the way. So that being said, I hope maybe you guys, if you have any other questions that you would like to ask, or if you want to see this thing up close off the off the display, come over and talk to me. If you want to check out the game or talk to any of the sales guys, we got a whole giant crew back there that would love to show you how you can download it and have it for you. All right. Thank you. Have a good day.